Start again, so you can hear me again. So mills and stills, you can all hear, yes?
Yes.
And see the pictures, good. Okay. Didn't move on then. Next one, please. So we start with Jim Bone's picture. This is a wonderful picture that shows Tarradale in all its cereal glory, as it were, and just underlines the fact this is a fertile area, been producing cereals, barley, oats, some wheat for a very long time. And if you have cereals, you need to do something with them. And obviously milling is a number one. Next. Okay, there's a lot of information here, I'm afraid. But what I did, the research I've been doing, is looking at what's called the Register of the Great Seal, which is basically the register of the monarch of Scotland's activities, and particularly things that he grants. And because the king had acquired what had formerly been the earldom of Ross and the lordship of the Isles, he was able to hand out the lands within these former areas to his friends and followers. So, for example, in 1526, he granted to Walter Innes the mill of Kilcaldrum, which we know as Highfield, just beyond Ord, with the land and houses, the lands of Ord, and the mill of Tarradale with its lands, crofts, and houses at a rent of 26 shillings and 8 a week. Now, this isn't the earliest reference to Tarradale and its mill, but it's one of the more substantial ones. And we get this lands being farmed out, if that's the right word, granted to various people throughout the next 100 and something years. In 1587, he granted to William Keith the estate of Ord. And then and the mill at Kilcaldrum again, and then Tarradale with its alehouse, and the value of that for rent was £5, 6 and 8, and the mill of Tarradale with its mulchers and croft, 33 shillings and 4. Now, I've said the word mulcher. In Scotland, it's pronounced mutter, but a mutter was the tax that the laird took off the tenants when they took the grain to the mill. They were thrilled to the mill. They had to take the grain to the laird's mill. The miller took his share, and then the laird has his share, which was the mutters. So that's why we know what was going on. So, but we have a reference here to Tarradale with its alehouse. Interesting. So the brewing beer and possibly doing other things, distilling whiskey, I would guess, as well as a mill grinding corn. And then a few years to Kenneth Mackenzie, several holdings in Rossshire, including Ord, with its mill and brewery and mutters, the lands of Tarradale with the mill and the brew house. So this is an important move. This takes Tarradale and Ord and many other holdings into the ownership of the Mackenzie family. And they basically dominated the scene most of the time thereafter. And I've put in brackets here, in 1598, the said Kenneth gave a lease of Ord to his son Thomas, which then passed to his son Ian, who was also known as Black John of the Firs. Now he will reappear in the story. And he in 1607 obtained a charter of the lands and mill of Ord. So he actually had a charter, which is a stronger thing. And in 1637, he was free charter. So he essentially became, the freeholder of the state of Ord. Tarradale, you see, has slipped slightly out of the story. And that is perhaps the basis of a little ongoing problem. And the Mackenzie of Tarradale. We'll return to that at the end. I'll forget about the quote of the food. Just carry on with the next one. But where was Tarradale's mill located? Next. Because no obvious mill site can be seen. Next. Was it on the site of the later distillery? Next. Now the 1788 estate map of Tarradale shows this distillery. If you can just see the bottom left-hand corner of the picture, you see Tarradale House in the middle of that, looking much as it does today. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see, it's rather difficult to read, but it says distillery with a long S. And you can see the little T-shaped building right on the edge of the stream. The wavy line coming down there is the Tarradale burn, running through the grounds of Tarradale House. So we know there was a distillery there in 1788, and there was no mill at all anywhere in Tarradale. So I was just wondering, was the mill at the distillery? Next. This is the range plan, 1870s. And what you can see with the blue circle at the bottom, the distillery has disappeared, no distillery. The burn is still culverted, and that's still the case today. But what you also see at the top of the picture, a little pond, little blue pond there. And just below that, there's almost the outline of a pond, but nothing in it. And I think that is a silted up pond, because that is my main pond today. So we're finding some evidence in the landscape. Carry on, next one. But we've had a lot about distilleries in this meeting. But distilleries tend to be fairly small things, particularly the early ones, as we can see on the left here. All you need is a supply of water coming in at above the level of the floor to cool the worm. Next. But the building, the distillery at Tarradale, is clearly a much larger construction. It's bigger than you might anticipate a distillery to be. So that may be the clue. Next. So was the distillery building the original mill? If it was, it's right on the burn. So if that's the case, it was likely to be a clack mill or a click mill, where the wheel is a horizontal wheel set right in the flow of the stream. So the stream could still be augmented by a dam if necessary. So in the absence of any other evidence, my best guess is that the old Tarradale mill is the same site as the later Tarradale distillery. Next. That's today. That's the site of the distillery today. Nothing to be seen. The burn disappears underground just behind the big tree at the top right. It comes out again at bottom left. That's all there is today. Nothing to see. Next. The ponds that we saw in the 1870 map. Next. That's what it looks like today. That's my main pond. Now, some of you remember that when there was a lot more water. When we moved to Tarradale 17 years ago, I had this pond completely cleared out with a digger. And for a few years, we had water. We even had ducks nesting on it. And now it's almost totally silted up. And I think this tells a tale. The Tarradale burn is rich in silt. And that's because it flows through agricultural land, but it doesn't flow very quickly. If it was much faster, it would flow more quickly to the sea and send the silt into the sea. But it seems to want to deposit it in my garden. So I think this is part of the problem, the silting up of the ponds. Next. So why did Tarradale mill site disappear? Silting, I think, was one thing, but there may be rather more to it than that. You could always argue, why didn't they just keep digging it out? The transfer or the appropriation of mutters by Ord before 1790. And we know that by the time the first old statistical account, OSA, which is compiled about 1790, published a few years later, there was one mill, well, no mill in Tarradale area, one mill in the parish possessing the thirlage from another estate, which is i.e. Ord mill had the thirlage for Tarradale. Now, we already guessed that was the case, but here is it, by 1790, Tarradale no longer had a mill, and the inhabitants of Tarradale had to take their corn to Ord, a mile and a half away, to be ground. But in 1799, thirlage was abolished, so producers could sell their grain anywhere. And Ord distillery was carrying on buying up the local barley, but if you had your own meal or whatever, you could have that ground wherever, though we still don't know where that was, but again, probably at Ord. Next. This is Ord Distillery today, or the original distillery, nice Victorian distillery, founded in 1838 on the site of an earlier distillery. There were several distilleries in Urry in the 1830s, but Ord, now known as Glen Ord, it sounds more Scottish than just Ord. Ord became the predominant one. It's now a massive place. But Ord has a very good water supply. You can see the hill behind, running up the hills there. The stream that comes into Ord is a fast-flowing stream. Next. And there is the 1870 map. You'll just see, even in 1870, quite a complex of buildings at the bottom of the screen. You can see the stream coming along at the bottom, supplying a pond by the distillery, and then an outfall and running down to the north there, the two legs joined together. Then you see there's a mill dam, and then beyond that, in the top of the screen, Highfield Mills, which are corn mills and sawmills. So a huge complex there at Ord and Highfield in 1870. And Ord and Highfield, though they're technically separate estates, they're normally held by the same person, so they're almost run as one. But this is in huge contrast to Tarradale, which is why it all went towards Ord. Next. That's just a modern one of Ord Distilleries, just to show the big complex, the nice big pond. Next. And that's the overflow from the mill this afternoon. I went out and photographed, flowing furiously. So they have no shortage of water. Next. Back to Jim's map. Aerial photograph. I've put here, full fat fields of corn need threshing. Forgetting about milling grain, into the 19th century, big farms were taking over this area, and farmers needed grain to feed their animals mainly, but also to feed themselves. So attempts were made not to grind grain, but to thrash grain, to get the grains out. So next, rather romanticized picture of men threshing by hand using hand flails. And this is from McKeon's Costumes of the Highland Clans, with a bottle of whiskey strategically placed at the bottom. My father, who was a farmer from a farming family, he can remember using a flail to thrash corn in the 1920s. And very hard work it was, apparently. So as these farms grew, hand threshing was no longer practical. So we moved to mechanical threshing. Next. And this is a rather faint picture of a horse gin or horse gang, a horse engine. You can just imagine a horse by the pole there walking around, driving that wheel, which with some cogs and things, operates a horizontal piece underground that drives a mill. Next. Here's, I mean, you're all familiar with these, but here's a nice picture, 1920s in Orkney there. So next. Now we know that there were a number of these horse engines, horse gins in the Tarradale area. Next. That, I put the blue circle because you can just see within it a very faint of the horse gang. They weren't usually covered over in Scotland. They were just an open circle. And they're marked in the Ordnance Survey 1870 maps as little circles. So Tarradale Mains Farm has a horse gang. Next. Bellevue has one, but Hilton on the right doesn't, and we'll come back to that. And next, and sorry, Balvati had it, but Hilton doesn't. Bellevue, where the buildings are separate from the farm, you can see large complex buildings there where it says offices. Hello, Shalon. And just in the top right-hand corner, there is the site of the threshing mill. You can see the circle there quite easily. Next. Next, here we are, yeah. So that's Balvati Steading today. Sorry, I was being too quick there. Balvati Steading, huge complex there. Next. And just at the end of the Balvati Steading, there is a hole in the wall, which is where the machinery went through, and the horse gang was just behind, where you can see the bracken. Not very large today, and nothing there to see, but that's where the horse gang was. Next. And inside that barn wall, there still is this big muckle wheel that was driven directly from the horse mill or other forms of power, and belting came off that. You can see to the right a little belt that might have driven your threshing machine, your bruising machine, your chaff winnowing machine, or whatever. Next. So we have got a number of horse gin sites, but there are two water power sites for threshing mills that come in the 19th century. The circle on the right is Hilton Farm. Remember, I said it didn't have a horse gin, but you know Hilton Farm, it's on the main road. You can see Muirboard in the background. It's now just a single farmhouse. And just to the right of that, you can just see a dark sort of mark on the landscape. It's running out the edge, the right-hand edge of the picture. That is the line of the burn. In fact, that is the Tarradale burn. It starts just on the right edge of the picture. It originally flew around the farm, and then down, you can see down towards Tarradale House. But Hilton Farm culverted the burn underground to come out at the farm. Then the other site on the left-hand side is another water power site. which we'll come back to. So next. So this is Hilton. As I said, it didn't have a horse gang, but on the left-hand side of Hilton, next picture, well, that's just a farmhouse. Next one. Still there today is this large water wheel pit just off the road. I visited this afternoon to make sure it hadn't moved, and there was quite a lot of water in it today. The water wheel's gone, but there is a thrashing mill or a water mill operating, thrashing and other farm machinery using the Tarradale burn, but using it gets into it. Next. Okay, so back to Bellevue Farm. Remember, Bellevue was the one with the horse engine. You see at the foot of the offices with a big circle. But Bellevue, being an important farm, also went one step further, and they actually built a water power as well, giving an either or. So if there was water, they would run it by water, the wheel. If not, they use horses. Now you can see the dam there, the sluice. And this is a steep little ravine that runs down the steep coastline to the marshy area at Tarradale. What I'm showing with the big blue arrow at the top left is where the stream emerges, because it isn't a stream in the true sense, it's a drain. That was a drain that was constructed, we don't know when. So they're utilizing a drain. Next. Next one. Thank you. And this is the 1788 map. Again, you can't see the detail, but you can see the big black areas. These are the kettle holes, which in 1788 were largely drained. There were mosses, peat bogs. But we know that at some point, and we don't know when, a drain was made to connect all the kettle holes. Next. And if you just look at the detail here, and just towards the bottom of the picture, about a third of the way in from the right-hand edge, you'll see drain written at an angle just above the road. So that drain connects that. And you can just see it there at the top. Then it connects all the other kettle holes. You can see the drain going around the back of Kilchrist Church where it says Killichrist. There's a red line at the back. That's a drain going into another kettle hole. Next. And re-emerging, as we saw in the last picture, just above the sluice. So that drain, which was created to drain the land, and I think it may even be 17th century, but it was to drop the water level so that the land drained. It also drained the kettle holes and allowed the moss to be exposed and the peat to be worked. But it wasn't a continuous source. I mean, the kettle holes are only dependent on rainwater. So in a dry season, that drain would dry up, which is why they needed horses as well at Bellevue. But a nice, as I said, belt and braces job there. Next. And that's the remains of that dam today. This was this afternoon. Still there, still a feature in the landscape. Next. Back to Jim's picture. So we've seen here a landscape, a rich landscape. I'm coming to an end. A rich landscape of cereal production, medieval, early post-medieval times, with a mill within Tarradale, the grain mill disappearing, then in later times, threshing mills coming back to use horsepower and water power. Next. But there's an interesting little coda to this story. In the middle of Muir of Ore, there's this cairn called the Carna Clarsa, the Harper's Cairn. And if we have the next one, it'll tell you the story. It's a local legend that is endlessly repeated. I don't know the source, the first source of this, but it's always repeated verbatim. Story goes back to the 17th century when Ian Dua, who is known as Black John of the Fair, an ancestor of the Mackenzies of Ord. Now, he was in fact the grandson of Kenneth Mackenzie, the first Mackenzie to get Ord. He is said to have taken umbrage at the Laird of Tarradale and resolved to do him an injury. Lots of people have taken umbrage at the Laird of Tarradale over time. But the Laird of Tarradale, of course, I don't know what the umbrage was. Anyway, Ian Dhu proceeded at midnight with a band of gillies to Tarradale and stole the millstones. Making off with the spoil, they overtook a wandering harper near the Tarradale Hotel, and lest he should give away any information, they murdered him on the spot. A good story, nice local story. Does any of it stand up to examination? But all legends have a germ of truth in them somewhere. But you can find a few faults here. Umbrage at the Laird of Tarradale, what does that mean? A band of gillies and stole the millstones. Have you ever millstone? One under each arm and walk along the road? I mean, millstones are immensely heavy. I mean, a small stone, 2-3 feet in diameter, will weigh 200 or 300 kilos. So it's not something you can make off with overnight. And he bumped into a wandering harper. How many wandering harpers have you bumped into at 1 o'clock in the morning? And why would they murder him on the stone? So I think, there's a lot of fluff here, but there is a story. So if we go back to the 17th century, the early 17th century, when the Mackenzies got Ord and Tarradale, then they became owned by two different Mackenzies. I think there probably was a bit of going to and froing, particularly if Tarradale needed a better mill, and it sold its mulchers, its mooters, to Ord. So this may be this may be a more allegorical theft. It wasn't that the stones themselves were necessarily stolen in the first place, but the right of milling was stolen. It went from Tarradale to Ord. And I think that is maybe the core of the story. It might well be that the Laird of Ord says, well, if I've got the thirlage, I may as well have the stones as well. And maybe he brazenly went and took them. But that's another story. But that's where I'll end. Thank you very much.